Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. We have a great program ahead of us today in a very short period of time where we'll be covering a lot of material. Today's topic is twofold. We'll be discussing how to avoid the worst hiring and real estate catastrophes in your dental career. We have a great presenter today, David Harris. He is the CEO of Dentistry's Embezzlement program. He is an embezzlement expert with Prosperident. I'll be the second speaker. In the second part of the program, we'll be discussing the lease agreement and how to properly structure that and prevent going through some detrimental mistakes as you negotiate that lease agreement. So I'll let David go ahead and begin the program.
Well, thank you very much, Jess. As he said, I work with staff stealing from dentists every day, and one of the things that I see very quickly is the hiring mistakes that dentists make. And there's kind of a perfect storm here in the sense that I know very few dentists who got into their profession because they really, really wanted to run a business. For most dentists, that's just the horrible curse that comes with the privilege of owning a dental practice. And some of the reasons that mistakes are made, first of all, dentists hate hiring staff. I've asked thousands of dentists in live audiences how many of them enjoyed the process of starting with a pile of resumes and getting down to the one candidate they want to hire. And I've had very few dentists say that they enjoy that process. The second problem is that often hiring is done in a panic. Somebody leaves on short notice and they are kind of mission critical to your office, and you end up having to fill a vacancy in a very short period of time. A couple of statistics that should force every dentist tuned into this to sit back and pause for a minute. The first one is that in the United States, 65 million adults have criminal records. So that means that 1 in 4 United States adults has a background. Do those backgrounds necessarily mean that they're not hired? Of course not, but the fact is that a lot of people have done something bad in their life, and as an employer, that is information that's important to you. The second information that's important is it is estimated that roughly 60% of resumes have some amount of embellishment or misstatement or outright fabrication. And we cannot take a piece of paper that an applicant who really wants a job gives to us as being completely truthful. So in my mind, there's a perfect storm. And this allows people like serial embezzlers, so these are people who have stolen in multiple offices, to get hired relatively easily without a lot of scrutiny. Here's what one convicted felon said on a chat line that I follow, and please forgive the illiteracy here, but she said, no background checks unless you work with kids, great money, easy hours, and the same thing over and over again. So what she's really talking about is how easy it is for somebody with a checkered past to get hired in a dental office. So how do we do it properly? How do we avoid hiring people like the lady on the screen who had 4 convictions for working in 4 different dental offices and stealing from them? How do we stop the Marissa Miners of the world? I'm going to start by giving you some basic hiring advice that may have very little to do with specifically keeping embezzlers or that hygienist who insists on using the same Profi cup all morning out of your office. And then we'll progress to trying to find out the things that they do not want you to know. The first tip is a basic one, and yet I see a lot of people mess this up. Before you start looking at candidates, you need to define what you're looking for. And this has to be a little bit more in-depth than I'm looking for an outgoing, personable dental assistant. What the dentist really needs to do here is to be a little bit introspective. If I'm not good at talking about money with patients, then when I hire people for front desk jobs, they have to have that strength. So you need to do a little bit of self-assessment. You need to figure out what you're not good at, and you need to hire people who are going to provide skills in areas where you are weak. If you don't do this, then what you end up doing is hiring people you like, and not a terribly good way to run a dental office. The second tip is this. Every dentist I've ever talked to understands the concept of a short notice list for patients. What hasn't occurred to a lot of you is the need to do exactly the same thing for staff. In other words, when you are at a dental conference or even conceivably a restaurant and you meet somebody who you could see as being a fit in your office, you need to write that down. Get their name, ideally get a phone number, and then next time you're looking, go there first instead of that whole slow process of putting an ad on your favorite online job search site and waiting for applicants to come through and then sorting them out. So if you can encourage yourself to become a collector of names, a collector of potential staff members, then life gets a whole lot easier than starting out cold when you need somebody. So you're in a restaurant tonight, somebody gives you really great service, hand them a business card and say, you're great at what you do. If you ever thought of a career change, I have a great dental office over there and I'd love to talk to you. And go to that step. So let's get away from starting cold when you need somebody and having to fill a job in 3 days. Everybody's local economy is different. Where I live, if we post a job, we'll get 100 applications. And one of the first challenges is how do I get down from that 100 to the 10 or 12 that are really viable candidates? And what we use is some arbitrary rules. For example, one of the things that we do is that we require applicants to submit their response by email. And immediately that screens out people who can't use a computer or who don't have an email account. Because for what my company does, and I'm going to think for yours as well, those are basic required skills. The next thing that we do when we post a competition is that we put up a random reference number. I mean, the first 4 digits are the year, so if I was doing it this year, the first 4 digits would be 2017, and then after that, we make up a number. And any job posting that we put up requires people to quote that reference number when they're applying for the job. So anybody who doesn't do that, their resume gets thrown away immediately because those people can't follow instructions. And if they can't follow my instructions in the process of getting hired, when we have to assume they're trying their best, it certainly doesn't bode well for them as a job candidate after that. I'm also interested in literacy. And if I get a resume that has a grammar mistake or a typo or it just doesn't look good, that immediately goes in the garbage. What we should assume when we're hiring somebody is that they're on their very best behavior. This is as good as they can make it. If somebody gets an interview, the way they are dressed when they show up will be the best they can possibly dress for work. And when they actually show up for work at your office, it's going to be somewhat downhill from how they appear at an interview. So if they're not well dressed to the interview, it's only going to get worse. If they have grammar or typo or poor visual appeal in their resume, the written communication that comes out from them when they get the job with you is going to be at a lower standard than that. Put another way, if somebody has literacy issues and they don't even know it to the point where they go to somebody who is more literate and say to them, can you please review my resume to make sure it's okay? If they don't go to that step, they're not going to communicate in a way that makes you happy. The other thing we do is anytime we get a generic cover letter, these are the ones addressed to Dear Sir or Madam, you know, and don't mention the specific job that they're applying for. You know, I'm applying for the job that you recently posted, kind of thing. I'm not terribly interested in these people. They're not interested in me enough to sit down and write a letter and address it to me and say I'm applying for the position of investigator that you've posted on Kijiji. Another mistake that I see dentists make a lot in the hiring process is they ask questions to which there's an obvious answer or a coachable answer. So if you ask people if they mind working evenings, for example, if I'm the one being interviewed and I want the job, the right answer is obvious to me. The right answer is, of course not. It may be that I actually can't work on Thursday evenings because there's nobody to look after my kids, but I'm not necessarily going to tell you that in an interview. My logic is I will get the job first and then fight that battle after. So when you ask that question, there's an obvious answer, and a lot of candidates who want the job will give it to you. I also see a lot of dentists asking questions to which there's a coachable answer. And what I mean by that, the classic example is you ask an applicant, tell me about your strengths and tell me about your weaknesses. Anybody who's had any interview coaching knows that when they talk about weaknesses, the ones that they give should really be hidden strengths. Like, sometimes I just set my standards way too high, and then I try to achieve them. Or I will not let myself go home from the office until everything is done. And they're answering the weakness question, but they're giving you something that you're going to look at and say, well, you know, if that's her weakness, this is a pretty good candidate. What we encourage dentists to do when they're interviewing staff is to use role play questions. In other words, put them in a situation and ask them how they would respond to that situation. And take stuff from real life at your practice. You know, the difficult patient who wants the treatment but doesn't want to pay for it. Or the person who asks somebody at your front desk, well, do I really need this treatment, or is the doctor just trying to pay for her new cottage? Put them in real life situations like that and ask what they would do. And if they can do well in the stressful situation of an interview with that kind of role play, they will probably do well working in your office. So you need to develop a list of these. They need to be position specific. In other words, the ones that you would use for a hygienist are different than the ones you would use for a receptionist. And of course, when you're interviewing candidates, you need to give them each, if you're interviewing for an office manager position, you need to give each applicant the same role play question so that you can have a good basis for comparing. The other thing about role play is that you always need to adapt to consider people's different levels of experience. Somebody who's a brand new dental assistant will not do as well in those questions as somebody who's been doing the job for 15 years. Okay, let's talk about what people are hiding. There is actually a website, and I still cannot believe this exists, but it's called www.fakeresume.com, and it talks about how to create fictitious work experience and how to use references that will survive reference checks and things like that. So let's think about what people are hiding from us and how we can uncover it. And let's talk about checking references. By the way, this is something that should be mandatory for any applicant. You absolutely must check former employers, bearing in mind that the applicant may not want some of these conversations to happen. So the first rule is simple. When you're phoning a former employer, do not phone any phone number that an applicant gives you. Go to your favorite online search engine, look there, find that phone number, and then you know who you're speaking with. One mistake that a lot of employers have made is that they call somebody thinking they're a former employer, and they're actually the uncle of the applicant with a disposable cell phone who gives a great reference. We want to find exact dates of employment. When somebody is trying to hide unsatisfactory work experience from you, one of the ways they can do it is to play with the dates that they worked for people. The way you find that is to ask the former employer what was their start date and what was their end date. You should never give a former employer the dates on the resume and ask for confirmation, because in my theory, most humans are lazy and will simply agree. So ask the former employer, what was the start date, what was the end date, send them back to the resume, send them back to the personnel file, compare it with your resume, and if there's any inconsistency between the two, walk away from this candidate. Another good question to ask an applicant's former employer is, who did this person work for before you, and when they left your employment, where did they go? So we're trying again to independently verify information that the applicant has given you on a resume. The money question, the one that you should always ask is, would you rehire this person? And there are two beautiful things about that question. The first is that it's safe to answer. In other words, a former employer may be reluctant to answer certain questions, but this one is pretty safe for them to answer. The second beautiful thing about it is that any answer other than a yes means no. If you have a former employee and they were great and somebody asks you this question, you're going to say, yes, they were great. If you're on the other side of this and you ask the question and you either get, no, they weren't great, or 3 seconds of silence, they mean exactly the same thing. The other one that people run into sometimes is the applicant who says, please don't contact my current employer because my boss does not know that I'm leaving. And most dentists, being not terribly skeptical, will simply say, okay, I understand that, and never call that employer. When we step back from this for a minute, there are two possible scenarios. One scenario is that this is true. The other is that the applicant was actually fired at that job 3 weeks ago and doesn't want you to have a conversation with the person who fired them. So when you are presented with this, what your response should be is, I understand that completely. I want to let you know that we only hire people after having that conversation with their current employer, but it doesn't have to be right now. We can hold off on that until we've completed the rest of our screening process and then have that chat. And if somebody is gaming you, as soon as you say to them, we only hire people after having that conversation, they will just abandon the hiring process. There's no point in their continuing because they know they're not going to get the job. Here's what one of our victims said about the embezzler. She said, after I fired her, I checked out the phone numbers that she gave on her resume, and none of them matched. The other thing that people will use to try to hide unsatisfactory work experience from you is they will claim that they were out of the workforce. I was traveling through Europe, I was home with my children, I wasn't working. And again, it might be true, or it might be that they work for somebody who they really don't want you to call. So that's why the questions about previous and subsequent employers come in, and it's also why we need to investigate workforce gaps. So if somebody says they were traveling through Europe, my response would be, that's great, please bring in your passport. And if they say to me, well, I lost that passport, Now, instantly the hair on the back of my neck is standing up, and I will say, all right, then bring in hotel receipts, something that proves that you were there. So our response when somebody says they were out of the workforce should be, we need proof. If I want to make a room full of dentists squirm, it's easy for me to do. What I say to them is this: think back to the last person you hired, whether they were clinical or administrative, it doesn't matter. Think back to the last person you hired. Did you check their photo identification? And normally what I have at that point is a room full of dentists looking at each other saying no. And I say, all right, so your office is pretty important to you. It is the source of your livelihood. It is full of confidential information. There's a lot of money that comes in, and you have the ability to dispense controlled substances. And with all that, you don't know the true identity of the last person you hired. Here are the series of things that I think should happen when you're hiring somebody. As I say, we want to check ID. Can a driver's license be forged? Of course it can. But most people applying for a job with you who will apply under a false name will not have the presence of mind to go and get a photo ID that supports that false name. We need to do a criminal records check. I am astounded at the number of dentists who do not drug test applicants. I cannot get a $12 an hour job delivering parcels for United Parcel Service without a drug test, and yet I'm guessing that everyone in the audience today is not drug testing applicants. We should check somebody's credit history. Poor credit is not necessarily a reason for you not to hire somebody, but you better know about it. We need to verify license or credentials if somebody needs them to practice like a hygienist or a dental assistant. And we should not be trusting any piece of paper. If your regulatory body has an online feature where you can check whether somebody's registered, you can do that. If the regulatory body does not, then you need to call them. And finally, I would not hire somebody in 2017 without checking their social networking. And I'm looking for a lot of things there, and time doesn't really permit me to go into them all, but one thing I will look at, for example, is the time of day when they're posting stuff. So if somebody is supposed to be on the job and they're posting on Facebook, that's a time thief and somebody we probably should not be hiring. Last comment I'd like to make is that there are a lot of people out there who want a job in your office who shouldn't get it. And you need to be vigilant, and you need to be skeptical. Most dentists, as I said at the outset, absolutely despise the hiring process. And when somebody comes along who looks like the perfect candidate, every ounce of skepticism vanishes from that dentist's brain. And that's exactly when the mistakes happen. So when you're talking to the next applicant, what needs to be running through your mind is that there's a 25% chance this person may have a criminal record and a 60% chance that not everything on their resume is true. I'm going to end with a special offer that has absolutely nothing to do with hiring. We sell something on our website called an embezzlement risk assessment questionnaire. And this is designed to help the dentist assess whether somebody's behavior is consistent with embezzlement. So it's something that we normally sell on our website for $129. What I'm going to offer is that any dentist who's tuned into this webinar can have it for free, and all they need to do is send an email to the address that's on the right-hand side of the screen, request@dentalembezzlement.com, and just mention the Cirrus webinar and that they would like the link to the questionnaire. Thank you very much, Jess. I'm going to turn it back over to you to talk about the dangers in real estate.
Thank you, David. That was a very informative portion of the webinar today. Again, guys, if anybody wants to take advantage of the embezzlement risk assessment, do reach out to the email there, dentalembezzlement.com. He's more than happy to set that up. But moving forward to the second portion of today's webinar, we'll be discussing how to avoid the worst real estate catastrophes in your career. So my name is Banga. I'm one of the senior consultants here at Cirrus Consulting Group, and part of my role here is to provide guidance and educations on a critical aspect of a dental practice, and that is the lease agreement itself, how to avoid the aspects of the lease agreement that can be detrimental in the short term, but most of the time, from our experience, it's something that's affected later down the road, particularly when we're looking to sell the business. So today's program, I think it would be best to start off with a little bit of background on our group and who we are, what we do exactly, and how we effectively provide guidance for our clients. So we were founded back in 1994, back when a group of dentists were having trouble navigating the commercial real estate world. We were effectively founded by a group of dentists really to protect and guide the dental community when it came to understanding the nuances and critical aspects of the office lease agreement. Prior to our existence, most doctors, when it came to the negotiations of their office lease agreement, would speak with either a local attorney or with a local broker, but there was many challenges that arose as a result of that mindset. Having dealt with a broker, many of our past clients who previously worked with a broker came to quickly realize that many of the legal provisions that were structured into their office lease agreements weren't adequately addressed. And that's mostly due to the fact that brokers do not have a legal background. Their core competency lies around the financials, negotiating rental rates, negotiating tenant improvement allowances, in addition to many of the other various facets that are involved in the financial aspects of the deal. There is a bit of a conflict of interest there when dealing with a local broker, given that brokers are compensated on a commission basis. So they're a bit of a disincentivized to negotiate lower rental rates as their compensation would be effective as a result. And because they are paid on a commission basis, they typically push through the deal as is and overlook the various legal provisions that you're obligating and committing to in a long-term dental lease agreement. On the other hand, dealing with a local attorney, many attorneys are great at what they do, but very often we found, having dealt with clients that previously worked with a local attorney, that their area of expertise was very wide, that they didn't have a specific dental understanding of how a practice operates, the significant investment involved with establishing a dental practice, as well as the implications of the assignment provision when the doctor is looking to transition. And lo and behold, since 1994, we've really been supporting the dental community, aligning both the kind of the brokerage aspects minus the commission and the legal understanding of the lease agreement to ensure that our clients are properly structuring their lease agreement to protect their significant investment and that asset that they've built over the many years. So since our inception, we've actually negotiated over 10,000 office lease agreements all across the country, whether that's here in Canada or all across the United States. We've spent a number of time just in markets understanding the specific areas of concerns with local market details and understanding, what current market values in terms of fair market value of rental rates are. And on an annual basis, we'll negotiate over 1,000 dental office lease agreements all across the country. We're quite unique in the way that our group is structured in regards to the fact that we do have an in-house legal counsel. All of our legal counsels have a background in healthcare as well as tenant representation, truly understand how a dental practice operates on a day-to-day basis, the impact of leasehold improvements, the significant cost and valuation of building out a dental practice. They're supported by our in-house brokerage team, our leasing department, who act, in the sense where they have access to key performance indicators, rental rates, fair market value, availabilities, and vacancy rates. They provide us the same snapshot of information, have access to the same information your local broker will have, except they do not derive a commission. And lastly, we have our consulting department, which is the group that I'm a part of. I spend my time extensively lecturing across the country, providing guidance and educational programs for doctors so that they understand exactly what they're committing to as it relates to commercial real estate and the business of dentistry. We work in a very collaborative fashion, supporting one another to ensure our doctors are properly supported as we negotiate a reasonable deal for them and look to get some great wins for our dental clients. Part of the service that Cirrus provides for the dental community is providing over 150 CE accredited seminars. They're specifically for dentists to provide them education on commercial real estate, understanding how it impacts the business, how to properly structure the lease agreement. And of course, we lecture at many of the major dental conventions, being the keynote speaker at the Greater New York Dental Meeting, Pacific Dental Conference, the Yankee Dental Conference, California Dental Association, as well as the Hinman and some of the other not so major dental conferences. And for us, it's knowledge is the key. Anytime that we're dealing with a dental client, they're not well rehearsed in understanding commercial real estate, and very often let things slip through the cracks when it comes to the legal provisions in the office lease agreement. So our mandate as a group is, number one, provide education and training to doctors so that they don't enter into an agreement that can be a major catastrophe for the practice, and providing them strategy in ways that they can better structure their lease agreement to protect their valuable asset and their business. So just to give you a little snapshot of some of the clients that we're actively negotiating currently today, we have a number of clients all across the country. We have clients all over California, Washington, Nevada, all over the West Coast, including Alaska and Hawaii, in addition to the East Coast. Many doctors in Manhattan who believe that they can't negotiate with Manhattan landlords. What I can say from our experience is we've had great success in markets where, most doctors were essentially going to take the deal as it stood, and, really didn't have the ability to have a real conversation with their landlord with regards to structuring a proper agreement. So as you can see here, we have a number of clients all across the country and have a lot of great testimonials and success stories from doctors in the past of their experience with dealing with our group and effectively negotiating a proper lease agreement. So the first question I'd like to pose to all of you that are in attendance here today is, what is a lease agreement? What is this document? And what is the first thing that comes to mind when you think of a lease? And when I ask this question at my live seminars, I get a wide array of answers. Some doctors believe it's a contract, an obligation, a commitment, but at the root of it all, it truly is a check. It is arguably one of the biggest checks, the lease agreement, one of the biggest checks that you will sign in your entire career. And I'd like to repeat that. One of the biggest checks that you will sign in your entire career. For most doctors, the dental career spans for a period of anywhere from 25, 30 to 35, and now we're seeing doctors stretch out their career to about 40, sometimes even longer years, where they're occupying a space. And if we just do some basic math and understanding kind of on averages, the average dental practice, based on our experience, is about 2,000 square feet, and the average rental rate is about $5,000. If we look at that at a yearly basis, that is a $60,000 commitment. Now, most lease agreements escalate on a 3% increase, but for simplicity's sake, let's say the lease agreement and the rental rates negotiated are flat for the entire term and absolutely do not go up, which it never happens. Obviously, they go up year over year. But, taking that in a 10-year period, we're looking at a $600,000 commitment based on a $60,000 a year rental rate. If we take that over the course of the average lifespan of a dental career of 30 years, you're looking at a $1.8 million commitment towards a landlord to occupy and have your dental practice in the landlord's facilities or space. Now, if someone had told you at the beginning of your career that you were about to sign one of the biggest checks in your career, I'm most certain that we would have spent a bit more diligence in understanding what we were committing to. So part of today's webinar is to understand what are the obligations, what are the terms and commitments that we're committing to, and how can we better negotiate a favorable lease agreement. So why is the office lease agreement so important? As a dentist, you are one of the most unique type of tenants to have. Actually, we're starting to see a trend where landlords are really looking to secure long-term stable tenants, which are dentists. For a dental practice, on a per square footage basis, it is arguably one of the most expensive industries to enter into. On average, across the country, just doing leasehold improvements alone, dental plumbing, dental electrical, we're looking at $150, and of course that number ranges depending on which market you're in, but $150 per square foot just on leasehold improvements alone. So there is a significant investment and cost to building out your dental practice. So much more important to have a lease agreement, which is the only agreement that stands between your practice and the landlord and dictates that relationship. So very important that we have it structured to protect that significant investment, ensure that we have long-term stability and continuity in the space. The office lease agreement is important because your office location is the foundation of your practice. The bricks and mortar where you reside and where the practice sits today is there to support the local environment and the local community there. And if we move the practice, we often see attrition occur for a variety of reasons. Patients unable to access your practice, or it's out of their normal zone of travel. So very important that we have long-term continuity because you exist in that community based on where your location is. And lastly, the lease agreement is very important because it is very difficult, expensive, and time-consuming to move. For those of you that have gone through a build-out, you may note that it takes anywhere from the moment we have an idea to start a dental practice to the day that we open the doors and are able to provide great dental work for our patients. It typically takes anywhere from 8 months to a year and a half before we can go from idea to opening the doors. So very difficult and expensive to move that dental practice. So it's very important from a structural standpoint that we do have a level of stability built into that agreement and that we are protected during the course of our tenancy. And lastly, but most importantly, the lease agreement does have 100% impact on our ability to eventually transition and ultimately sell the business. The assignment provision, which I'll briefly touch base on during today's program, has 100% impact on the transferability, which impacts the eventual sale of the business. So critical that we structure that well in advance in preparation of an eventual sale. There are 3 major key components of your dental practice that are sellable components. The first being the equipment, the depreciated value of your equipment. For those doctors that are in the last 5 to 10 years of their career and are beginning to determine what their transition plan will look like, we truly believe and like to instill in all of our clients or attendees at our seminars the mindset that we need to correlate our transition plan with our real estate plan. And a part of that is ensuring that the practice does have up-to-date equipment, digital equipment, paperless equipment that is of modern class and is of modern standard. For an associate that's looking to acquire your practice, most associates today are looking to acquire a modern practice and make minimal investment into improving the space or improving the general equipment, and really are looking to achieve or acquire a turnkey practice. And with respect to that, when you do invest into new digital equipment and supplies and whatnot, you do recuperate that cost in the eventual sale because the equipment minus the depreciation does factor into the valuation of the business. The second item that does factor into the overall appraised value is the goodwill. It's simply the goodwill is how much revenue does each patient derive and what is the total value of the patient production. So production, we see practices typically go from anywhere from 75 to 80 to 90, and in some markets 120% of production. So for those of you that are in the last few years of your career, I certainly recommend not to curtail your production because your practice will get appraised on the last year or 2 of the production. So important to keep our foot on the pedal right to the end so that when we are ready to sell, we are getting maximum value. And the last factor that comes into the appraised value is the lease agreement, the terms, the conditions, and the quality of the lease. If there are onerous terms like a relocation provision where the landlord can arbitrarily relocate you, it does hinder valuation, in addition to items like a redevelopment clause where the landlord can arbitrarily redevelop the property if they're looking to build a condominium or a large business tower and essentially evict you as a tenant. In addition, the lease agreements, the rent rates, if they're not based on fair market value, we often see practice valuation on the eventual sale diminished by a specific factor if the rent rates are out of whack with the marketplace. So when we look to get a practice appraised, if you're using Henry Schein's practice transition team or a number of the other appraiser groups that deal with dental appraisals, they do factor in three major items: the equipment, goodwill, and of course the lease agreement. So I'd like to begin and really focus in on what should your office lease do for you. The lease agreement should provide you with fair and affordable financial terms. Base rental rates should be based on fair market value, with escalations based on CPI, Consumer Price Index, which is an economic indicator of inflation. We've seen historically, the last 7 or 8 years, inflation be at a rate, or CPI be at a rate of 3%. So we often see lease agreements structured based on CPI. So as the market increases and the value of the market increases, so do our office lease agreements. But we certainly want to ensure that those increases are fair and reasonable, but also the triple net cost. Most lease agreements are triple net, whereby the tenant is obligated to pay base rental rates in addition to taxes, maintenance, and insurance. And we often see landlords fluctuate either of those numbers to increase their revenue stream. So it's important, as we structure the lease agreement, we add mechanisms that ensure that the landlord is transparent with the actual costs that they're allocating towards us on a prorated basis. When I reference prorated, essentially prorated means our square footage in relation to the total square footage. So if you're in a triple net lease in a 10,000 square foot building, whereby your practice occupies 1,000 square feet, you would be obligated to pay 10% of the additional cost. Therefore, if there is a cost of $100,000 to maintain the property, landscaping, snow removal in some markets, painting, changing of carpentry, upgrades to the common areas, roof repairs, repavement of the parking areas, we would be obligated to pay $10,000 if the total cost was $100,000 based on our 10% prorated expense. But critical from a financial standpoint that we have fair and affordable financial terms built into the lease agreement. The lease agreement should also provide us with a long-term location, stability and security. We typically advise our clients to structure 20 years of continuity in the lease agreement, 10-year plus 2 5-year options, or 5-year plus 5-year plus 5-year plus 5-year, which is 20 years of continuity. We also need to factor in some of the underwriting standards of the banks. When we look to sell the practice, the banks do require a minimum of 7 to 10 years of term for the buyer to be guaranteed to have in the space for amortization purposes. The banks will not be willing to provide a $500,000 or $1 million loan when there's only 2 years of term guaranteed for the buyer. So we do have to be cognizant of our remaining career, as well as providing runway for a future buyer of the practice for the banks to provide amortization. We certainly want to have long-term stability and continuity in the space, ensure that the landlord cannot pick us up or arbitrarily relocate us or redevelop the property, or effectively terminate our lease agreement. Again, because of the significant cost in building out a dental practice, much more important as opposed to other tenants, other commercial tenants, like an accounting firm or a law firm or a nail salon, a tanning salon, or even a bookstore. For tenants like that, very easy to pick up and move all the items that make up their business over the course of the weekend. For a dental practice, not the case. We also look to achieve in a lease agreement to minimize your risk and exposures. For all of you that are in attendance today, I certainly recommend going through the incorporation process, because your lease agreement should be structured through your corporate entity, providing a veil of protection between your personal assets and your practice assets. When I speak with many doctors, I often find that they have structured their lease agreement under their personal name. What that entails is that they have collateralized their personal assets under the lease agreement, their home, their car, those of their investments, their beneficiaries or estate, are not the ideal position to be in. Not too much of a concern when you're a beginning doctor, but as we continue in our career, much more important to separate our personal assets from our practice assets, because as we know, as we exit dental school, we often come out of dental school out of debt. But as our career moves into fruition, we typically see a increase in our asset base and a decrease in our debt. So much more important to separate those two entities, personal and professional assets. And of course, we want to maximize our flexibility, have rights built into the lease agreement for us to effectively transfer and ultimately sell the business when we're ready to do so, and ensure that there's minimal landlord interference. Incorporate items like a death and disability provision, which will allow our estate to transfer the lease, God forbid something happens to us. What's interesting is we are, as a dental tenant, as a dentist, we are a hands-on industry. Our hands are our tools. If there is any issues, carpal tunnel, hand tremors, back problems, items like arthritis, these are items that prevent us from practicing wet finger dentistry. If we're in year 2 of a 10-year lease agreement, we certainly want to structure, in the event of a health concern or worst case scenario, we pass away, for a state to either terminate the lease or go through a sale without landlord interference. But very critical from a structural standpoint that we maximize our flexibilities and build that into our lease agreement immediately. And lastly, we want to enhance our ability to eventually sell the practice. Again, ensure that landlords will not receive any proceeds of sales, that they cannot manipulate their consent to receive some portions of the sale or increase the rental rates. We often see very opportunist landlords who have an understanding that a large transaction and a significant transaction occurs when you're ready to sell your business from buyer to seller. So important that we enhance that ability and minimize landlord interference as we are ready to entertain an eventual sale of the business. So what's in your lease agreement? The first item I'd like to discuss is the assignment. Again, this assignment provision has 100% bearing on your ability to transfer or ultimately exit out of the business of dentistry. This is found in about 75% of office lease agreements. So I'll go ahead and read the provision in the interest of time. If the tenant should wish to assign or sublet the lease premises, it shall first have received the consent of the landlord. Any request for such consent shall be in writing. Within 15 days after the receipt by the landlord of such consent, the landlord shall have the option to either terminate the lease or to revise the minimum rent to be paid during the remainder of the term to the greater of then current market rent for the lease premises, or 15% greater than the then current rent. Notwithstanding the landlord's consent to any assignment or subletting, the tenant shall not be released from its obligations under the lease and shall remain liable to any failure of the tenants or its assignees or subtenants to observe each and every covenant of the lease. Again, this is found in 75% of dental office lease agreements that we review here at Cirrus Consulting Group. So the first item here that is quite alarming is the fact that we need to receive consent of the landlord. However, it does not state in here that the landlord cannot unreasonably withhold consent or condition or delay. This opens up the landlord to have the ability to essentially interfere with that transfer and derive some value from that transfer. Landlords realize that a large transaction is occurring and will often meddle in between that transaction to either A, receive a proceed of sale, B, increase the rental rates. So the last thing that we want to see is the landlord interfere, and we have an anticipation that we're going to derive a set value for our retirement plan. However, the landlord interferes and we're provided with less than the full value of the business. We also see here, again, it's critical from a structural standpoint that we minimize those landlord interferences and that we ensure that the landlord cannot condition or put items like financial net worth or business history. As many of you may realize or come to realize, our buyer pool, when we're looking to sell the business, is quite often consistent of associates who are heavily in debt, have very minimal business history. However, banks are willing to finance them at a 100% rate, but landlords will meddle with that transaction to essentially ensure that the future buyer has a similar credit score or a similar asset base. Not ideal position to be in, and it really lowers our buyer pool when we have conditions attached to the deal. The second item here is, as soon as we request consent to the landlord in writing, the landlord has 15 days and the option to either terminate the lease agreement. By simply asking the landlord for a transfer, the landlord can terminate the lease. What landlords will do is they essentially, if they do decide to terminate the lease, they're essentially getting a built-out dental practice which they can market in the marketplace at a premium given it's a built-out dental space. Very often they will leverage their termination right to receive a proceed of sale, a percentage of your appraised value of your business to provide consent. Not ideal position to be in, and we certainly want to get ahead of our assignment well in advance of our eventual transition. In accordance with this assignment provision, the landlord also has a right to revise the minimum rent and effectively increase the rental rate. This impacts the appraised value of your business because if the rent rate consistently is going up based on this condition, then typically we'll see tenants or buyers of your practice lowball you an offer to offset this rent increase. So not ideal position to be in, and we certainly don't want the landlord to meddle in our dealings and impact the appraised value of our business. The last item, and again, I often find this in the majority of office lease agreements, and I refer to this as continuous liability. Essentially what this provision is stating at the end of the paragraph here is you are, as a seller, as a doctor that's looking to transition and ultimately sell his business or her business, that you are to remain jointly and severally liable with the buyer. So in the event that the buyer defaults on the lease agreement, you as a seller, even though you have cut ties with the practice and are no longer practicing dentistry, have provided this joint liability whereby in the event of dispute, the landlord can come after you for damages if they cannot recuperate damages from the buyer immediately. So the seller remains jointly involved with the lease agreement. The challenge in Catch-22 with this ongoing liability is it typically is for the remainder of the extended term or the assigned term. But because we need to approach and renew the lease agreement for an additional 7 to 10 years, in order for the buyer to receive financing, we often see doctors who have not reevaluated this provision remain jointly liable for the remainder 10 years of the deal, even though they're not there. Let's get well in advance, and there's various mechanisms that we can incorporate into the assignment provision to either A, eliminate your liability upon sale, or minimize that liability, whereby we cap it to a set value or cap it to a set period of time, where after a certain point of time when conditions are met and the buyer is not in default, the seller will no longer be jointly liable. The last thing that we will ever want to see as we enter into retirement is to get a knock on our door or a phone call on our cell phone stating that we owe a certain percentage of rent because the buyer of our practice defaulted. So again, I encourage all of you to take a look at your assignment provision just to understand if there is ongoing liability and what provisions are entailed with the consent ability of the landlord. So what is the cost of this mistake? The cost of this mistake, if we cannot sell the business, is having to shut down and rebuild elsewhere. If the landlord will not allow us to transfer the lease agreement, then we will not get full appraised value of the business. We will get a minimal value just for the patient goodwill. So in order to get full value, we have seen doctors rebuild elsewhere to recuperate the full value of their business. Having to absorb significant increases in rent. The last thing we want to see is the landlord increasing rent simply because we want to extend the lease agreement or transfer the lease. Paying the landlord a percentage of your sales. It's becoming all too common today where the landlord is effectively saying that the value of your business is attributed to where the business is located as well as the leasehold improvements. Just as a note, as a side note, once we install leasehold improvements or affix any items to the premises, i.e. bolt them down or any of that plumbing and electrical, it does become property of the landlord. And when we do go through a formal appraisal of the practice, that leasehold improvement, which essentially is property of the landlord, does factor into the overall appraisal. So landlords are cleverly arguing and very logically arguing that they are entitled to a proceed of sale, A, because of where the business is located, and B, because part of the property that they own is factored into your appraisal. So we strictly like to outline within the lease agreement to alleviate any issues or concerns in the future that the landlord is entitled to a percentage of your sale of the practice. What is the cost of this mistake? Anywhere from $250,000 to $750,000. It is a significant cost if we have to rebuild elsewhere or we go through a skyrocketing of our rental rate, or if the landlord derives a percentage of our sale, there is a significant cost associated with not having a properly structured assignment provision. The next item of merit I'd like to discuss, and we find this in about 50% of dental office lease agreements, and quite frankly, if I was advising a doctor that was looking to acquire a practice that had a relocation provision, I would say walk away from the deal. Quite frankly, I would say run away from the deal. Not ideal to have a relocation provision. Not ideal to have a relocation provision built into your dental office lease agreement. So I'll go ahead and read this particular provision. To the extent required in landlord's reasonable judgment to accommodate an expansion or reconfiguration of the center or an expansion by a major occupant, landlord shall have the right to relocate the premises to another part of the center in accordance with the following criteria. The new premises shall be substantially the same size. The physical relocation of the premises shall be accomplished by landlord at landlord's cost, and all incidental costs incurred by tenant as a result of relocation, including, without limitation, costs incurred in changing address on stationery, business card, directories, advertising, and other such items shall be paid by landlord in a sum not to exceed $1,000. We often see relocation provisions in a multi-tenant strip plaza or a large building, a business tower, where there's multiple tenants or professionals that occupy the space. We recently dealt with a case where we had many doctors on a floor where there were about 4 or 5 dental tenants on that one floor, but a large law firm wanted to take over the entire firm. The tenants were forced into relocation on a 60-day notice, which essentially didn't provide them ample time. So the first item of concern here within this right to relocate by the landlord can be found in landlord shall have the right to relocate the premise to another part. Very expensive and time-consuming to go through a relocation. Again, as I mentioned earlier, it takes anywhere from 8 months to a year and a half to go through a physical relocation, going through architectural designs, layout, permits, variances, and then the physical contracting and construction of the new site, installation of leasehold improvements, movement of equipment and supplies. It takes a very long time to open the doors. We often see a significant gap between when the lights are turned off at our practice and when the lights are turned on in a new practice when a practice does go through a relocation. If the relocation does exist, we want to ensure that there is no gap, because as soon as there is a gap between one opens and one closes, actually effectively when one closes and the other one opens, we see patient attrition occur. And as weeks go on, patient attrition multiplies and magnifies quite significantly, where it's not reattainable to go back to the original production levels. So again, let's identify if this trap exists in your lease agreement and develop a strategy and plan to eliminate this out of the lease agreement. The other item here that is quite onerous is that the new premises shall be substantially the same size. The word substantially is arbitrary. It's ambiguous in nature. If we go up in square footage, then we're obligating ourselves to a higher rental rate because we're paying for more space. If we effectively go down in square footage, that could mean a loss of an operatory. As I mentioned earlier, the average practice is about 2,000 square feet. If we go down to 1,500 square feet, we can lose one of our 4 operatories, which means we're effectively losing a significant chunk of production. The other item here is the physical relocation shall be accompanied by landlord at landlord's cost. Shall be paid by landlord in a sum not to exceed $1,000. That is a laughing joke. In order for a dental practice to go through a relocation, we're talking about a significant amount of money in order to physically build out that site. $1,000 will simply take care of some of the stationery. It does not include physically going through the build out or having the landlord install our fixtures, our trade fixtures on the new site, and ensuring that there is no gap between when the practice opens and when ours is to close. Not ideal to have this. Ideal position in the negotiation is to remove this relocation altogether, but realistically, some landlords like to have that flexibility to place any tenant in anywhere in the property. For example, if a Starbucks wants the Great Corner unit, and that's where you currently occupied, and Starbucks is willing to give the landlord twice the rent that you're currently providing and providing twice or 3 times the traffic flow that your practice provides for the center, then the step down from there is to metric out how that relocation will occur, identify exact size of the new relocated site, ensure that there's no downtime between when the site opens and when our site closes, and ensure that the landlord is covering all costs, ensuring that we have ample time, that we have a window of time, somewhere from 270 days at minimum to 1 year plus, ideally, to go through that relocation. Again, patient attrition is affected if the practice is closed and we're not up and ready to go on the new site. So again, ideal position is let's move it all together, but there are a variety of step downs in the event the relocation persists. What is the cost of this mistake? Having to relocate elsewhere. We support our local community when it comes to providing patient care. If we move outside of our local vicinity of where the practice is, then it could be quite detrimental, as patient access to our practice may change and hinder their ability to take treatment at our practice. Having to relocate elsewhere in the center, visibility concerns. If we're in a large tower, being in the basement area or being on the top floor when we currently occupy the ground floor, it can certainly be an issue if we're very hard to locate or the visibility has been affected as a result of the relocation. But most importantly, downtime. If there is downtime that occurs, patient attrition can be quite significant. And what is the cost of this mistake? Anywhere from $300,000 to unrecoverable. If we're down for a period of a year, very difficult to rebuild our patient roster, because patients will seek care elsewhere at another practice and typically will stay loyal to their current doctor, whoever is able to provide patient care to them. The last item that I want to present, and unbeknownst to many doctors, is the surrender of the premises. When we're ready to, at the end of our term of our lease, hand back the keys to the practice. And for some doctors who, at the end of their career have the asset base to go through a purchase of a property and become the landlord and tenant, we often see these types of tenants hand the keys back to the landlord. But there may be some liability and risk concerns when they're ready to terminate their lease agreement. Many dentists are forced to incur the cost of hundreds of thousands of dollars in demolition and construction. These costs, when they're ready to exit their practice, as per the surrender clause in their office lease agreement. Essentially, what the surrender clause entails is that the landlord requires the tenant to restore the space back to original shell, pre-dental condition. So removing of all our cabinetry, removing of all the leasehold improvements, the plumbing, the electrical. It's the last thing we want to see when we're ready to, move to a site that we built out or a site that we acquired, a property we acquired, to invest into essentially putting the space back to its original condition. We typically like to metric out in the lease agreement the exact status of the space when the lease is ready to terminate. The cost of this mistake is anywhere from $100,000 to $200,000 depending on which market you're in and depending on square footage of your practice. But we're looking at anywhere from $50 to $75 per square foot in demolition costs just to restore the site. Very expensive to build a dental practice, very expensive to break down a dental practice. So be aware of your surrender premise, the surrender rights within your lease agreement, because it can have broad implications at the end of your career when you're ready to exit. Because in the interest of time, we did cover just 3 particular aspects of the lease agreement: the assignment provision, the relocation provision, as well as the demolition or restoration surrender provision. There are a number of other metrics that we look to achieve when we open up the lease agreement. There are many parts in the wheel as we navigate the negotiations of the office lease agreement. When we get involved in a deal, we open up all aspects. And for those of you that are looking to negotiate your own deal or looking for guidance, it's important to understand what to ask. And if we don't know what to ask, then we can certainly not achieve the results that we're looking to achieve to protect our significant asset and our practice. Important that we are aware of exactly what's involved in the lease agreement, but secondarily also important to understand how to ask for these changes. Happy to provide some guidance on that, and as we review your lease agreement, these are a number amongst other things that we're looking to identify and provide you some guidance on the impact on the practice itself. So as a group, and since we've been in business for the last 25 years, we're a very process-oriented group. Before we ever pick up the phone and call the landlord, there's a number of steps that we go through before we even actively negotiate on behalf of our clients. And again, knowledge and having a process in place is critical to the successful outcome of the negotiations. The first step that we do is grab and gather all documents and all ancillary documents, the original lease agreement, any addendums, extensions, modifications, riders, essentially any documents that are relevant to the lease agreement. Gather all those documents, spend some time with you to identify your practice and career goals, what your transition plan looks like, how long you plan on practicing, are you planning to bring on associates, opening up multiple practices, or going through an expansion. Critical we understand what your objectives, views, and goals are as we review those documents. And then we go through a formal review of the office lease agreement, highlighting the potential traps and risk within that document, providing a treatment plan for them. But also speaking with our market research group, when it comes to the financials, we leverage our leasing department to understand what fair market values are and current market conditions look like in order to have a successful financial negotiation. Understanding what sites around the area are offering on a per square footage basis to be a tenant in their property. Once we're equipped with that science and data, we're able to develop an outcome and strategy development plan, understand what the strategy are, what are the big ticket items that we're looking to achieve in the negotiation, items that we are willing to concede on, but important that we ask for everything in order to achieve those big ticket items. When we get involved, we typically review all aspects of the lease agreement with a fine-tooth comb to understand where areas of the lease will impact you as a practitioner. Up until this point, the one thing we haven't done is picked up the phone and formally had a conversation with the landlord. But before we've even done that, again, we have a treatment plan in place, we have a process ready to go, all documents have been reviewed, and we have a strategy and plan going forward. At that point, we would negotiate the financials of the deal, keep everything at arm's length. Always, and I'd like to highlight this and really ensure that all of you are critical about this, is understand what fair market values are and what the landlord's looking for. The landlord's looking to structure fair, reasonable rental rates, and that's what they truly care about. How much rent you're paying and how long you're paying it, how long the term is. But typically the first part of the conversation is negotiating the financials, but always critical to put those numbers on paper and have everything defined and have a record and track of how those negotiations are going and what the landlord has agreed upon, because we do not want to have verbal conversation about financials and then we get a copy of the lease agreement and the financials are way different than what we had a conversation on. From there, once the financials have been negotiated, and when I speak of financials, I speak of a few things. For startup doctors, tenant improvement allowances, which is inducements by the landlord to help us, afford a build out at the beginning of our career. Again, for those of you that are planning to go through a build out of the practice or start a new dental practice, important to understand that tenant improvement allowances aren't free money. They get built into the deal itself in the form of higher rental rates later down the term of the lease. We often see landlords recuperate that tenant improvement allowance that they provide you at the beginning of your career by having a higher rental rate, and usually within year 7 to 8 of the lease agreement, they're at a break-even proposition, and year 9, year 10, and for the option renewals, because the rent rates are higher than market, they're profiting quite significantly. We would then move forward to negotiating the lease terms, the financial and legal merits of the lease agreement, having a conversation and educating the landlord on the impact of these provisions on a dental tenant and how they can have a significant detriment to the practice itself. Again, we go through multiple red lines and back and forth with the landlord to achieve a good result for our clients and ensure that the lease is properly structured to protect our asset and ensure that we have long-term continuity of the space. And lastly, we go through a final review and execution, ensure that the landlord does not pull a bait and switch, and all this great work that we've done for the last couple of months negotiating on your behalf are all locked into that lease agreement and are all agreed upon in that lease agreement. But before we have our client sign off on the deal, ensure that the lease is consistent with the items that we negotiated during the negotiations of the lease agreement. So for all of you that are in attendance today, important to have a process in place and following a strong process and being educated of what to ask, how to ask it, and then when the appropriate time is to ask those items. The other item that I'd like to stress and highlight is the lease cycle itself. And when I speak at various live seminars, I spend quite a bit of time on this particular slide itself because the lease cycle is critical to the success of the practice. Before we expire, we absolutely require or would like to have, from a leverage standpoint, a window of 2 years before the lease is set to expire. It provides us with ample time to explore multiple options. For example, if the landlord is unwilling to compromise on rent rates and is proposing a 50% or a 100% rent increase, it may be more advantageous to go through a build-out on another property elsewhere, as our break-even proposition may be in year 7 or 8 if we have to go through a relocation. But again, with any negotiation, timing is critical. As we approach the 12-month period, our negotiation leverage significantly diminishes. Landlords are aware of the timeline it takes for a practice to get built out and go through the motions of getting approved for ADA compliance, as well as getting permitted and site designs and so on and so forth. And what we have seen based on our experience is that landlords will often delay the process as much as possible because they realize as soon as you enter that 8-month window, they effectively can provide you with a take it or leave it deal. Otherwise, you cannot or have the timeline to go through a build out. And that's when leverage is at its absolute lowest, is when we approach that last 8 to 6 month window. Effectively can provide us a take it or leave it deal, whether that's a rent increase or providing us onerous terms and conditions on a legal standpoint in the lease agreement. It can certainly impact the negotiations. So one critical item I'd like you all to take away from today is begin early. Have our ducks in the right row, be prepared for the negotiations, have all documents and ancillary documents ready on hand, have an understanding of the local market, and do that before you even pick up the phone. But again, do it well in advance of the expiry date. And also, be aware of your option to renew deadline. For doctors that were in an original 10-year lease with 2 5-year options, there typically is an option to renew deadline whereby the tenant needs to express whether they're going to stay or leave to the landlords well in advance of the expiration date. As soon as we pass that option to renew deadline, our leverage again significantly diminishes and landlords can provide us with a take it or leave it deal. So part of today's program, I do want to provide you guys all with some great value. We do offer 2 services. We offer a lease assessment as well as a professional lease negotiation service. We do have, because the course is running in collaboration with Prosperident, we were able to provide a great subsidy to provide a complimentary status towards the lease review. So the second item that we offer, in addition to the negotiation of the lease, is a review of the documents and any ancillary documents and provide you some guidance and strategy going forward. It's typically a $1,500 service. We are offering a limit of 20 complimentary complimentary lease reviews. So it is being done on a first come, first served basis. So for those of you that are interested in taking advantage of the complimentary lease review, free feel to email me or give me a call so that we can coordinate that effort. Appointments will be scheduled on a first come, first basis and as soon as documents are provided. But the critical dates and risk analysis is twofold. We spend 3 to 4 hours analyzing your lease traps, going through the legal provisions of your lease agreement, as well as doing a financial review of the document. Having our leasing department provide us with fair market value, competitor rates, so that way when we do enter into the negotiations, we're well equipped with data to support our arguments when it comes to the financials. Part of the review and consult consists of understanding your vision, your plan going forward, what your transition plan looks like, expansion plans, opening up multiple practices, or even exiting out of the business of dentistry and transitioning out. Your vision and plan are critical into understanding the nuances of the lease agreement. We'll also provide you some guidance on what the ideal lease should look like. We have our standard form lease agreements, quote unquote, but we also provide you some guidelines on how to properly structure that, what the lease terms and conditions should look like. But then also provide you with a plan on how to negotiate effectively, a tactical plan on how to approach the landlord, whether that's through our group or if you're doing it personally, a plan to have the best outcome from the negotiation. And again, it's critical that at any option to renew period or when we're signing a new lease agreement, that we structure out how the lease looks like and how the assignment process looks like for the eventual sale of the business. Important that we do that well in advance. As we enter the latter phases of our career, much more difficult to negotiate that or those items that protect the practice into the lease, because the landlord understands that a new tenant may be taking over the property, a sale may occur, but very important that we are rehearsed and are aware of exactly what's in our lease, what our commitments are, what our obligations are, and how it can impact the practice. So my name is Banga. I'd like to thank all of you for joining today, and obviously thank David for his great program on dental embezzlement. Feel free to reach David here on his cell phone to set up the conversation to discuss, to fill out that questionnaire regarding embezzlement and get a better understanding of your staff and your practice, as well as understanding with some of the training protocol in determining who will be a good fit for your practice. And then please do reach out to me. My name is Banga. My email is jbanga@cirrusconsultinggroup.com. My number is 1-866-739-9075, extension 3247. Feel free to touch base with me to coordinate and schedule a lease review time and set up a period of time where we can review that document and understand fair market values. I do want to stress that we do have a limit of 20 complimentary reviews that will be covered by our core sponsor. So it is on a first-come, first basis, and appointments will be scheduled on a first-come, first-served basis. Again, doctors, thank you for spending your afternoon or morning with me and David to discuss embezzlement and the lease agreement. Hope you found today's program quite valuable, and we look forward to hearing and speaking from you as you coordinate the questionnaire or the lease review. Thank you.